Right now, Pittsburgh's best sports show is about to begin. Call us or tweet us. We've got things to talk about on the Ireland Contracting Nightly Sports Call.
Lars Eller was one of those guys that they acquired during the offseason that I really liked that move. It wasn't necessarily a top 6 guy who was going to do a bunch of different things offensively, but Lars Eller at the very least is a very smart player, knows how to work open space, just knows how to do those little things and make very consistent, efficient plays when the opportunities present themselves, and he took advantage of one there in the second period that tied the game. 412-575-2600. That is the number to give us a call, or you can shoot me a tweet over Josh Taylor HD. We will take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about our tweet of the night. We're taking your phone calls. We're answering tweets. We're doing all of it when we come back. Stick around. Welcome back. Time for our GMC Sierra tweet of the night. Comes from Ian Rappaport, NFL.com. Sources, the Falcons are hiring Rams pass game coordinator Zach Robinson as their new offensive coordinator under Raheem Morris. One of the most popular interviews on the OC circuit. Robinson was Morris's top choice. And those two, of course, have history dating back to their time with the Rams. So I guess that's not that surprising. Raheem Morris was defense coordinator there at one point. So it's not that surprising to see those two guys reunite in Atlanta. Hannah Mears, by the way, joining me on the show. Hannah, here's a question. Raheem Morris getting the nod at Atlanta after they interviewed Bill Belichick. I believe they brought in Jim Harbaugh for an interview, but they go with Raheem Morris. Your thought with that move in the coaching search here when it felt like Belichick was maybe all but a slam dunk going to the Falcons?
Yeah, I feel like, well, let's start with the Bill Belichick side of it. That almost seems like a really risky move, in my opinion, if you're a team. I get that he's the GOAT. He's the greatest of all time. You have all of these things for him, but I think he was very exposed these past few seasons without Tom Brady, and I think that's a huge risk. I also think if you're looking at someone like Bill Belichick, you're getting it his way or the highway. I just think he's one of those guys, and so I'm going to say that's kind of unappealing to a lot of teams unless they're in a desperation mode and being willing to hand over the reins. But in my opinion, I think a guy like Bill Belichick is walking in asking for a lot, and I don't think a lot of teams, someone like the Atlanta Falcons, who there's glimpses of hope in there already, I don't think they're willing to just hand him everything and think that he has the magic puzzle to win a Super Bowl in 1 year with a team. So I think that was less attractive in a lot of his interviews. I will at least think that would be my opinion, something that could be going on behind the scenes. But Jeremiah Miller, I'll give him a shout out. He was just talking about Morris, and I think there was a domino effect here of wanting Robinson and Morris, because he was talking about how Robinson, Morris, those two are guys. So I think that probably had some bit of a role in how that affected was they get one, the dominoes fall, they get the next. So yeah, I'm going to think that's how it goes. And that relationship factor does play in a lot when certain jobs happen. And to your point about Bill Belichick, I think there's something that sticks out here. Two things, really. Number one, they just moved on from Arthur Smith, who really had shown throughout the course of the past season kind of stubborn, kind of stuck in his ways, not really trying to change anything up and do anything different. Also, Bill Belichick coming in with Desmond Ridder as your quarterback, and we already saw what it was like when he doesn't have the quarterback. Do you want more of the same? Clearly, Atlanta did not do that. However, let's talk about the ripple effect of that, because Zach Robinson was a name that had been connected to the Steelers. There had been some speculation there. The Steelers never announced that they officially interviewed him. They only announced two men, Thomas Brown and Jerron Johnson being the other one. But the thought process of the Steelers going with guys that particularly have a lot of experience with quarterbacks. Your thoughts about that? Well, Tomlin came out straight up and said that in his press conference, saying when there were things he was looking for in an offensive coordinator, it was somebody who was a prior NFL offensive coordinator with that experience, but someone who also knew how to work with quarterbacks. And it makes sense, right? Because clearly we saw that Kenny Pickett is going to be QB1. So now Tomlin wants someone to enhance Kenny Pickett's skills, or at least create a legitimate quarterback competition. And so I think anyone out of that McVay system you feel really good about looking at an offensive coordinator candidate for. So I think it does stink to lose Robinson. But something that I think is also really important to note, Josh, the Steelers are interviewing offensive coordinator candidates who a lot of other teams in the league seem to be interested in as well. I don't think that's something that we've seen a ton in the past. So I think that's really promising in Tomlin standing on his word that they're looking outside of this organization. Now, Jerron Johnson is a very interesting candidate to me. Jeremiah and I were talking about this, where that could be a sneaky way to maybe get someone who has been in the Steelers system before. Now,
True.
it was so brief that I don't think it really counts, but there is a little bit of a tie with him having been a fourth-string quarterback at one point. But I think he would be interesting because worked with a guy like C.J. Stroud.
Yep.
C.J. Stroud said Johnson changed his life, and now look at how he's performing. And I also think it's interesting to note with this quarterback situation, Josh, you tell me your thoughts. He has worked with none other than Kirk Cousins. Could that play a factor in here at all?
That's a name that keeps getting linked to this organization is Kirk Cousins. And I'm one of those people that's kind of thinking buyer beware. He's coming off of that really bad Achilles injury. You wonder if he'll be ready in time. But that's another one of those relationship links that you put together and you start putting 2 and 2 together and you get 4. While we're sticking with the discussion about quarterbacks and offensive coordinators, I'm glad you mentioned the Sean McVay side of it. And you brought up C.J. Stroud, which I thought was important. And when you're talking about the Steelers situation where they are right now, with a quarterback who's not necessarily a rookie in Kenny Pickett, but he's still on his rookie contract. He's going into that 3rd year. You're trying to figure out what you can do with him. And you want to get somebody, maybe that doesn't really overhaul everything, but maybe can fix a couple of the things that need to be tweaked and maybe improve upon those. And maybe you get some of those things that Kenny Pickett couldn't seem to shake this past season. Maybe he breaks some of those old habits.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Do you think, Josh, I'll throw this one back to you. Do you think it would be smart, and Jeremiah and I had talked about this too, what if Tomlin doesn't get his perfect guy with everything that he wants in an offensive coordinator with, okay, they haven't maybe worked with a quarterback before, but somebody like Thomas Brown has a lot of running back experience when you look through his resume. So maybe he enhances your run game, and then you go get a really strong passing game coordinator and a really strong quarterback coach to maybe just focus a little bit more and have that one-sided, and then have your offensive coordinator scheme something up based off of what your quarterback coach or your professional passing game coordinator is suggesting. Do you think that's sort of the strategy here? Because when you're listing all of these things about Kenny Pickett, I completely agree with you, and we can go around and around about that. But what's the best way to approach that, I think, when you look at this?
I think what you just laid out is a really good plan B. It's the plan B that I wanted last year. There was a guy specifically that I wanted because they weren't going to fire Matt Canada. But I was like, if you can bring in maybe a special offensive assistant, a guy who can work with quarterbacks, help really smooth careers out. And this is a guy who helped out one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time in Peyton Manning. Jim Caldwell was a name that I kept cranking out over and over again. It'd be nice to have Jim Caldwell coming in. Well, just so happens he ended up taking that kind of role in Carolina, and that didn't work out too well. So if you need a plan B, can I just recycle my answer that I had from last year?
Absolutely.
And say the same thing? Because I think if we're talking about the situation where you can't get a guy that you think, that, like you said, or the guy you can't get the guy you think you would want, if you can try to find a way to maybe emphasize that run game and bring a guy that can just clean up the passing game and smooth out some of the edges, I think somebody like that, or maybe even a David Shaw, might be a pretty good option as well. Let's go to Jim in Peters Township. Jim, you're on the Nightly Sports Call. Hello, Jim.
They're going to have a locked-down bullpen. Think about it. Haldeman in the 8th, Chapman in the 9th, and the hometown hero from Mars how did you think Texas won last year? Shut down bullpen.
Actually, that's a good point, Jim. That's a really good point.
All right,
Thanks for the call.
We pivoted here, straight to
really
the Pirates.
And Jim brings up a good point, because this is something I discussed last night with Colin Dunlap. We were talking about this particular signing with Aroldis Chapman, and Colin brought up a good point. They're going to have to try to strike a balance and figure out, hey, whose role is going to be what here? Because Aroldis Chapman didn't really build his career in being a late inning specialist, Hannah. He built his career in being a closer that can throw 100 plus. So the question for me is, how do they find niches to carve out for each of these guys to make this work?
Yeah, I think you look at a guy like Haldeman, for example. I think that was one of the guys he had mentioned, who was a 7th, 8th inning guy. Then you can move him up possibly in inning 6th, 7th. They're looking to shorten these games, right? So I think those are the types of moves that will need to be made or can be made. But a lot of that's going to be based off of this young development. Paul Skeens, I think, plays a huge role in all of this and how early he can be ready, because then we'll get to see how solidified this bullpen can be and how early it can be set in stone. I don't want to see this having to change too much later throughout the season. I'd like to get a good look at it early, especially because these guys are young. But the biggest piece to all of this, Josh, your bullpen, yes, there's a lot of moves that need to be made. You kind of solidified the top and bottom, though. That's a big thing. But the catching, your catchers have to also click with a lot of these guys who are going to be taking the mound, and that's going to be a big issue as well. So it might not be, who's the perfect pitcher. It could be who has the best connection as well, and we'll get to see that. And if Henry Davis is clicking with somebody and he's possibly a young catcher you're putting in there, maybe that's who you're putting on the mound instead. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but I don't think that's a crazy approach that the Pirates could be looking at this year because of the Endy Rodriguez situation. So that also stirs the pot with this.
Yeah, that's a really great point about the catcher position. I want to say we talked about that, I think, with another guest, maybe Jeff Hathorn a couple weeks ago, but that's a really good point. And another thing I'll add to it, I'm glad you brought up Paul Skeens, because he's really just one example of a much bigger problem for the Pirates. They're not going to need just Paul Skeens. They might need 2 or 3 of these young arms that are in the minors, maybe 1 or 2 that are knocking on the door. A, they need somebody that's healthy. B, they need somebody that can give them innings. And C, they need somebody that's efficient. And Paul Skeens can't be the only one to do it by himself. So they got to figure out some other guys as far as young starters that can fill that hole as well. We got to take another break. We'll wrap up when we come back. Stick around.